Go. All right. Well, welcome back, and I'm excited to be moderating this Expanding Sustainable Rangeland Markets panel. I'm Karen Launchbaugh. I'm from the University of Idaho. I'm director of the Rangeland Center, and I've been doing range my whole life, and so I will not give you the whole details, but I will focus on some of the ways that we might make range a bit more modern, kind of think about some expanded ways that we could use rangeland markets. So with me today, I've got Cameron Mulroy, he's with the Idaho Cattle Association, Bob Howard, who's a rancher with the Desert Mountain Grass-Fed Beef Group, and then Liz Wiley, who is with the Idaho Wool Growers Association. And so they'll tell you more about their organizations and associations. But let me just set the stage for you. First of all, no doubt, rangelands are important. I love this old cowboy saying, an anonymous cowboy from Texas said that rangelands are where there's more water and more rivers and less water, more cows and less butter, and you can go further and see less than anywhere else in the world. Okay, with that in mind, let me try to convince you that they really are important, and especially to a rangeland state like Idaho. They are the resources and the kind of fabric of the state. 95% of the population of Idaho lives in rangelands. They live on rangeland soils, they breathe rangeland air, and about 80% of the western states people live in rangelands, so they're part of the fabric of our being. I'm also president of the Society for Rangeland Management, and our job is to help people learn about the stewardship of rangelands. We have sort of two groups right now that we're working with, and that one is ranchers to try to help them think about the range side of things. They know a lot about the cattle more than us range people do, but not as much about the ecology of the land. And then also I'm at the University of Idaho, and I try to help people, young students, get their head around the complex issues on rangelands. And so if we're going to have working landscapes, we need people out there who know what they're doing. And if you know someone who would like to live in a small town like Mackay or Burley or Salmon or Chalice, let me know. There are 8 jobs for every student we graduate in range, and I'm happy to hear from the NRCS is going to hire 3,500 more students. I don't know where you're going to get them. Send them our way. We need people out on the land who are well qualified, or all these policies and ideas that we have are not going to work. And it's not just about range or cows, it's really about that whole ecosystem and the collaboration. Okay, so rangelands are important. They're half the world, a little more than a third of the US, half of the western states, and our state here is 54. So half of the world is range, half the west is range, half of Idaho is range. So if no other reason, they're important because they cover a lot of ground. Most of that, of course, is in the west. You guys probably all know that pasture and rangeland is a yellow color, and that's important because those lands are used primarily for livestock. I'm not going to apologize for talking about livestock and ranching today because it's historically and currently a really important use of these lands. Of course, meat and fiber. They are the economically important aspect of many rural communities. Yes, historically, but also today. The ones that bring money into these communities across Idaho and across the West, they fuel those rural economies. And then I'm going to distinguish a little bit between grazing lands and rangelands. Rangelands are half the world. Grazing lands are more. There's a new study out that said 80% of the earth is grazed by domestic livestock. So certainly the shrublands and grasslands, but also pasture lands, forests, deserts, crop aftermath, anything that has herbaceous vegetation can be used and turned into something useful to humans, i.e. livestock, and grazing is an inherently important part of rangelands. Okay, also to distinguish as we go into this discussion, those grazing lands occur on both public and private land, and those are hard to separate. You're not going to do a lot of good by separating those two things because a ranch is a combination of those things. It's a wholly integrated operation. Many ranchers that work in the West, they don't even know where the public land stopped and the private land started. Even it's this, they're managing a ranch, not different tenures of land. 90% of BLM land is grazed. Almost 60%, a little more than half of the Forest Service is grazed, so grazed forest. And that supports 23,500 permittees. So those are the inputs that happen in small communities where those permittees are bringing that grass, turning it into beef or sheep, and bringing it home to their communities. And in Idaho, a study not too long ago showed that 88% of the beef cattle in Idaho spend some time on rangelands, public rangelands. And again, that's wholly integrated with the private. You take either one of those pieces of the puzzle away, I think you're spelling for disaster. Okay, so when I think about rangelands, of course, we'll talk about forage, important for livestock and wildlife. Water has always been important. Now let's start to think about some of those new resources that the panel will talk about. Things like recreation, renewable energy. If my grandfather thought that I would ever talk about the value of open space, I think he would crown me, because he was, his whole goal in life was to turn that open space into something that was economically viable. And now we're talking about open spaces being economically viable and important to society. So again, that's like a new resource that's been under our noses that whole time. So let's talk about expanding traditional markets. Let's explore some new markets. And I'm going to start with you, Cameron.
All right. Thank you, Karen. Cameron Mulroy. I'm the Executive Vice President for the Idaho Cattle Association. I grew up in a rural community in south eastern Washington. Lewiston, Idaho is the main hub for the community I grew up in. And the value of grazing lands, range lands, as you travel, you see how much the West relies on and benefits from these productive landscapes. And I say productive because they are. To a person that's part of farming or business or something that's not used to livestock grazing, they may look at that just as desert, or open space or dry land or potential for future development. But if you grew up in a rural agricultural type community, you see that as productive landscape that can benefit your community. Here in Idaho, we're a cow surplus state. We have more cows than people. And the majority of our cattle, as Karen pointed out, graze on some type of public range. That is a benefit to the rural communities around it, and also the citizens that live here in the state. And one thing that we'll address today a little bit, or talk a little bit about, is fire, and the issue that creates for the urban citizen that wants to be in Idaho, wants to have open space, wants to recreate, wants to do all those things. And fire is a large issue, and we have a tool that can take the fine fuels that create and quickly expand wildfire. We have a tool that can take that and turn it into a protein source that is marketable and economical for the nation, for the world. In Idaho, our cattle industry falls under one umbrella as far as representation here in Boise, and that is the Idaho Cattle Association. And that's a little different than maybe some of the organizations in the states that you guys are from. But it's all the basis of our industry in this state are those rangelands. We have the capability and the atmosphere to feed cattle here in the state. We have farm ground that provides that feed and, makes it economical. But we also need that cow-calf base. And that cow-calf base takes advantage of our rangelands that without the ability for a livestock grazer, whether it be sheep or cattle, to consume that forage and turn it into a usable product, we wouldn't have the ability to create more dollars within that piece of landscape. So those dollars then stay in rural communities. And here in Idaho, rural communities are everywhere. If you look at kind of the population distribution, we have our urban areas and there's a lot of people there, but as soon as you look at it from a landscape or a land mass situation, the number of communities that are urban are very small in this state, and I don't think that comes as a surprise. We were discussing some policy stuff the other day, and they said a campaign for the entire state of Idaho would not cover the campaign in a city in many other states. And that has to do with our population demographic, right? So there's only so many dollars in a cow, and getting them distributed and maintaining our rural communities is getting harder and harder. And there's a lot of reasons for that. But the one thing with these rangeland markets that we have to continue to look at is how can we continue to have rangeland production, and also, especially on the public lands, the people that are coming to our state because they enjoy the open space and they want to utilize it, And recreation, you know, for a long time has kind of been out there, but I will tell you it's becoming consumptive use on our rangelands. It is consuming, you know, resources from these rural communities. The cattle industry, in my case, is the one entity that is there continually and provides economic income for those rural communities year after year. Our folks that come there to recreate, they're kind of one-time money, so to speak. And when I say one-time, I understand they come more than once a year or maybe, you know, for multiple years. But when they come, if you're coming from this urban place here and you're headed out to the Owyhee front and you fill up your pickup here and you get your groceries here and you do this, the community of Murphy doesn't see the advantage of those dollars. Without the cattle industry, those communities would become ghost towns, similar to old mining towns. If they don't have the income source, they're not there. And the beauty of a rural community, if you've ever lived in one, you'll understand this, but people in rural communities keep their dollars in their rural community. They're proud of their community. They support their community. Dollars that just come in one time and leave often do the same thing. They come in one time and then they leave. It's the, you know, I'll give an example of the hardware store. There's a little hardware store in the community I live in. If I go in there to buy a bolt, I could buy it cheaper at Home Depot, right? But if I had to drive to Nampa to get to Home Depot, the cost would be the same, and I want my local hardware store to be there. So I'm going to spend that dollar there. In turn, I know they support the school there. I know that they support the local students, the local community. These rangelands provide for a community, and I don't want that to be lost. The cow-calf side, in our last prediction, this year is maybe going to see a $200 profit at the most, coming from our marketing guys. That $200 in a local community can really go a long ways. That's $200 per cow, not per operation. If it was per operation, we'd be in a lot of trouble. But that's kind of where the focus in that rangeland is that $200 per cow, and we need that to sustain local communities and create leaders. If you look across the state of Idaho, a lot of our leadership in this state started in a rural community. That doesn't mean they can't start somewhere else, but there's a certain amount of pride and workmanship and just identification that comes in those rural communities that have helped this entire state and people across the West. And sometimes we lose sight of that as we get more and more generations away from the land. With that, you know, there's plenty of other topics I'm sure we'll discuss through questions and whatnot, but that's kind of the introduction to Idaho's cattle industry and how it directly impacts these rural communities and range for those of you.
Thanks so much, Cameron. I appreciate your thoughts about turning that grass into something profitable, which leads to our next speaker. Bob, tell us how you do that. What's your take on the ground?
Good luck. So I'm Bob Howard, and I'm 64 years old, and I've always been a rancher. And we've always struggled with commodity markets, and every time you just get going, the commodity market, some black swan would fly in and part of your money would go away, and there you were struggling. And about 20 years ago, I was introduced to a fellow by the name of Doc Hatfield. And his concept was so much different than most folks that it's hard to even imagine. And it was about the good of the whole and everybody getting a piece of every ranch getting every piece of the supply chain. And so my wife and I and some folks named Wilsey started Desert Mountain Grass-Fed Beef about 6 or 7 years ago with that in mind, that we want to be every piece of vertical integration. And today we are, and it's been costly. None of it was free, and there was a lot of things that you didn't see and this and that. But it was so interesting when these folks wanted to visit about what I thought might help rural communities. And from being so vertically integrated as we are, one of our biggest costs is harvest cost. And so it just is fascinating how if you have the scalability of a huge packer, your harvest costs are $225 a head, or maybe less, and that's just an estimate. but they also can get the offal and all the other benefits that they sell that's worth so many dollars. In a small packing plant, that doesn't happen. I mean, these hides haven't been worth anything. If you had 40 hides, they were worth $400. How would you get them to somebody? and so the economies of scale is one of the things that's happened to the packing industry. And we found that as we grew our company, we thought, well, we'll get enough size so we can go to a bigger packer. And then COVID came along. And food insecurity became a very apparent thing to me of how will we feed the people during these pandemics and things. And one of the things that really became interesting beyond belief to me was the small packing houses all are booked out a year and a half now. I mean, you can't even find a place to harvest an animal today. We've let our infrastructure die down to where we're at risk of feeding ourselves. And I can get off subject pretty fast, so don't let that bother you. But anyway, so what I would like to visit with the panel about is how do we get this small packing business back, and how do we get scalability back to farms and ranches so that we can return those dollars to the community, exactly what Cameron said. We never spend money anywhere but home. It just is fascinating. And then there's another side of that that's really fascinating to me, because we market meat every day and we really pay attention to a lot of things, is how America has allowed these huge corporations to deliver all our products. We're only one truck strike away from not having anything. I don't know if other folks see it that way, but there's no way around it. There's only 3 days food in this town, and they tell me that the riots start when they miss the 7th or 8th meal. And so that's how vulnerable we became with the infrastructure we put in. But my proposal is let's try to put more harvest plants or kill floors in more areas of the United States. And people say, well, that's all well and good. How would we do that? Well, my one idea is we take the big 4 packers in the meat business. And I don't know how many people know how much meat goes on in the country every day. They kill over 100,000 cattle a day, or harvest over 100,000 cattle a day. 83,000 of them cattle probably belong to 4 companies. Well, what would happen if we put a tariff or a tax on those if you're over a certain size, and bring that money back to these small plants? So our kill costs today are $463 a head, and then we have another $145 a head in marketing on top of that on every animal. And I'm sure that the big 4 packers only have the $225 or $30 in their deal. And we're all selling a product to a consumer that wants the price to be pretty equal. But right in the beginning, we have to be $1 a pound higher just to pay these costs. And so somewhere in there, in order to make our country more stable and to skip this food insecurity in these small communities, we need to think about those things in a bigger picture of how do we do that. And I don't know, I have a lot more thoughts in my mind, but I'm not sure. I'll let Liz go on.
Right. And we'll come back. I think the idea of food insecurity is something we need to think about. Liz, I don't know if you knew that I grew up on a sheep ranch, and I'm really happy that there are someone's thinking about the sheep side. That industry has gone through a lot of changes, and I'm happy to hear that you say there's some bright outlook. And so please tell us about things that you see in the sheep industry.
Of course, thank you, Karen. And I didn't know you came from sheep
yes.
operation, so the more you know. Hi, everyone. My name is Liz Wilder, and I'm the executive director for the Idaho Wool Growers Association. And I'm also a sheep producer myself. My husband and I operate a seed stock operation where we supply commercial bucks for the range operations, as well as we do a direct-to-consumer business similar to Desert Mountain grass-fed beef. We are just called Boise River Lamb. And so wearing a couple hats here today, but I am very happy to be here and talking about the sheep side and how the sheep industry really plays into this big picture when we look at rangelands and rangeland management, as well as opportunities within an agricultural sector. And so the sheep industry is really a bifold industry in that from one animal, we're producing both meat as well as wool. And so there's immense opportunity for those producers to produce an item that has multiple use and to produce an animal and a byproduct that has multi-use in multiple markets. And I'm very happy to announce that for the first time in longer than I've probably been alive, that the sheep lamb demand in the U.S. for consumers is up 3% year over year. There's a lot of factors that have led into that, but we are also experiencing record high prices for our cutout. It is on a 6-week record high. I'm still waiting for it to fall, but it's looking really good right now, and we've just leveled out. Our Coal prices are also at a record high, feeder lamb prices. We are in a very good position. For the first time, I think I can say that in a very long time in the sheep industry. So the Idaho Wool Growers Association was established in 1893 by sheep producers in Idaho to be an advocacy and a marketing group to represent the sheep industry here in Idaho. A little history, Idaho has a very rich history in the sheep industry. We were here before we were even a state, and many of our past governors, senators, and representatives were involved in the sheep industry at one point. And so we are here as an association that works on behalf of that history and helps in the further development and marketing of our products. When I really look at rangelands and how sheep play a role into rangelands and rangeland management in not only Idaho, but the western United States, I always like to think of the word upcycling. And this goes for sheep as well as cattle. Anyone who the livestock industries that access public lands and grazing lands is we are upcycling. We are taking an area that is uninhabitable or it's undesirable for development, and we are using it to create a product that has inherent value, both in a sticker price that can be used for consumers later on that provides inherent value for consumers in the form of wool or protein, high valued protein, but it also is helping invest into those local communities like Cameron and Bob and Karen have been talking about and keep circling back to. And so my best view on rangeland management is that we are upcyclers of this area. We're taking an area that no one really wants to live in, or it's untillable for other areas, or it's really inaccessible, and we're creating a valuable product that is sustainable, it's regenerative, and it's inherently valuable. When we look at sheep, especially with our wool component, research is being done that shows the carbon sequestration power of wool and the sheep industry. And Karen's wearing a beautiful wool vest today, and we can actually say that that wool vest is a carbon sequester. It actually helped capture carbon out of the air, and it actually turned it into a valuable product that creates value further along in the food chain that we don't even think about. And so the sheep industry, we've gone through some pretty low lows, to be honest, but we are in a really exciting place right now. If we look at the industry as a whole, our national inventory is just about over 5 million. In Idaho, we have about 250,000 sheep that call Idaho home, and about 80% of that inventory is owned by 20% of our producers. And that's a pretty standard statistic across the country, but we're seeing a shift in that more and more people are engaging in the sheep industry. More and more people are buying 10 head or 50 head or 100 head, and they're finding ways to engage in our industry. And so not only are we having really exciting opportunities for our large-scale producers, but also for anyone and everyone that's interested in agriculture and sheep production specifically.
Great, thank you so much, Liz, and I appreciate the wool vest, but also I'm wearing leather boots, just for the record. But those are very traditional resources. I think everybody knows, well, I hope everyone knows that leather comes from cows and meat comes from livestock and wool from sheep. But what about the less traditional? Right now we're hearing, you mentioned fire, maybe using livestock for fire. Also looking about using sheep are very effective in weed control. So how do you internalize that in the modern livestock production? And if you don't mind starting, Cameron, how could we make that a revenue source for livestock producers?
Yeah, so, in the cattle industry, and I mentioned fire and utilizing cattle for fine fuels management. Fuels management's a big thing that we have to start to address. We've kind of been through a time frame where we had a no-touch approach on some of our rangelands for what we thought was ecological advantage. And for a little while it looks better, and then things look dry and dead, and I'm talking about the plant matter, and then it looks black, and it all goes up in the air, and it settles in Boise, and it settles in Salt Lake, and all the different places around the West where that smoke settles in. So one of the ways that we need to see, and I challenge the budget makers to look at how many states in the West had a reduced fire budget for next year. I don't know the exact answer, but I'm going to go out on a limb and say probably none, especially after last year's fire season in the West. So if we can control the fine fuels, and we started to see this in some targeted grazing opportunities, if we can reduce those fine fuels and decrease the fire severity, hence decrease the funding source needed to maintain those fires, how many dollars does now a cow return to your economy in your state, in your rural community? Those dollars are very important because if we're not using them to fight fire, we can use them other places. And now if you look even further and we start talking about carbon and greenhouse gases and emissions, etc., we need to know for every bit eaten by a cow, how much less is going up in the air if it burns. And I'm not a scientist, I don't have the number for that, but I would like to just challenge you to think about, would you rather have it go up in the air from a fire, or would you have it go through a cow and maybe it goes up, but in the methane cycle, in about a 12-year period, it returns to grass and water, and we just continue to do that. And right now our messaging maybe is saying, well, cows are killing the world, right? Because we have methane going up out of a cow. But what's the balance? What's the balance for that fine fuel reduced by a cow? And maybe at some point, there needs to be some credit given to the cattle industry, to the sheep industry for those. And those are alternative thinking, ways that every citizen in the nation can understand, and maybe the less than 2% of people in production agriculture left in this nation can show people that we are a benefit, we are a climate solution in all of this. It was mentioned this morning in a meeting I was in, and I do remember seeing it, but when everything was kind of shut down because of COVID, how much faster did the pollution go out of the air? The cows didn't stop eating during that time frame. We have a product with a shelf life. So I think, to Karen's question, there's an opportunity through some of those things that we've always just done that now in other industries people are getting credit for, that we need to figure out how to get credit for our industry, because we've been doing a lot of great things in U.S. food production for a long time that people, and we've all just taken for granted. And now that we're on the tip of the spear, we need to continue to show what we're doing and start getting the credit we deserve as an industry and the rangelands, and how we're helping this environmental message through our industry, not just that we have an emission through methane, but we actually have a cycle and we're a net benefit.
You raised, I think it was made this morning, the point about maybe stopping problems from happening. There should be some economic value to that, like stopping fires, and that will be a discussion in one of tomorrow's panels. So I think we'll be able to follow up on that. But would you speak a little bit about targeted grazing and sheep? They have a special role in that realm.
Absolutely. So one of my favorite sayings when it comes to wildfire management is only use can prevent forest fires. A female sheep is a ewe, so in case you didn't get that. But it speaks to this conversation that we play a very special role in preventing forest fire and in a sense even preventing or helping our Idaho taxpayers not lose their taxes to having to manage, fix, and recover forest fires. And so the sheep and cattle have a very special place in managing these wildfires, and we, like Cameron said, we need to be able to economically put a value on that, not only in the value that it is to taxpayers, but the value that it is to our public lands, because we do play a huge role in that. With targeted grazing, and you had mentioned non-traditional markets, there's a lot of work being done in non-traditional targeted grazing as well in the sheep industry, specifically really small ruminants, sheep and goats, where sheep are being brought in to solar panel facilities to help graze down the grass in between the panels. Here in the Treasure Valley, we actually have a couple of wineries that bring in sheep to graze in between the vineyard, in between the grape rows, as well as help with the trimming of some of the grape leaves. It's fascinating. As well as we're seeing this being done in some of the hop orchards here in the Treasure Valley as well. And so there's a lot of outside of the box, non-traditional ways that we can use targeted grazing and that we're seeing, especially when we look at small ruminants. Don't know how many of y'all are from Idaho, but here in Boise, there is a organization where it's like rent-a-goat lawnmower system, and they just bring in a trailer of goats, and that's how they are mowing lawns and ditch banks and whatnot. And so we have a really unique opportunity to use our livestock who are just doing what they do in a very natural, basic form, and use them in a way to help provide economic value for not only our taxpayers, but for our communities, in not just our rural communities, but also in our urban and our suburban areas as well.
Yeah, absolutely. I just put a plug. It is really important that people are well trained, whether they're doing targeted grazing of cattle for fire or sheep. You can do damage too if you're not careful.
Absolutely.
So the Society for Range Management, for example, has a certificate where you can become a certified grazer, because it's not a have goat will travel kind of business. It really is a lot of knowledge is needed.
Absolutely.
But I do think it is a way to get people started in rural communities in the livestock industry, and also to supplement. Now, it's not for everybody, because some people really got to focus on just producing beef. So, Bob, I'm going to send it back to you, because I'm very interested in your thoughts on the food security. How do we help people in cities understand the role that ranchers like you play in food security?
How would you restate your
Well,
question?
I agree with you that ranching is, and in the Farm Bill, we talked about that. The food security part of the Farm Bill is very important. Yet I think most people walking outside this hotel may not connect what you do with their ability to eat tonight. I'm just wondering, how do you go about that in kind of a daily?
That's a fascinating question. I wish I had the complete answer. What really helped with what we're talking about was this pandemic. When store shelves are bare, the light starts to come on. They ate more sheep in the last year, more lamb in the last year.
Absolutely.
And the beef market has been spectacular to the last part of the chain. But I'm not sure that it won't take another pandemic to really get people aware of what goes on, or if we could somehow equate how the product is brought to them. And I don't really have the answer of how to get the consumer to really understand that. I know that the consumer says they want to support local and they want to do this and that, but they want to do it at a dollar level. And so I don't really know the answer to your question. What I do know is that we, as a collaborative group, should be able to answer the question of how to do it. And we have to start addressing this delivery systems and what we're doing and how we're doing that to get to that point. And I want to say something else about this targeted grazing and all that. I'm so excited to hear that. I was on that 25 years ago. I've worked hard at this part of this deal. It's outstanding to sit here between young people now and hear that it can be done. We graze a deal that belongs to the Fish and Game, and we have for 25 years, and it was about this kind of thing. So we know it can happen. But back to this supply of protein, I really don't have the exact answer other than it'll have to come through a capitalist move. The money will have to be able to offset it. And so if you had a plant every 40 head or 100 head processing plant every 200 miles across the United States, the problem would just go away. If the folks could pay their help good and people could understand that it was delivering a protein to them. And so and I don't mean to be bashing on the packers of the big four. The reason that works is just because of scalability. They have a guy comes in at 8 o'clock and he cuts the same chuck for 8 hours. And it's coming down a conveyor belt just like that. But that's how you feed masses, as long as your transportation holds together. But if the transportation part of the delivery system has some holes in it, you won't feed the masses. Yeah. It just won't happen. And so if we could somehow support those smaller harvest plants to a level that they would be profitable, I think it would solve itself. And then I think they would come to ranchers and farmers within their community. And actually they're building that plant in Jerome under the same premise of people owning the plant together and bringing the cattle. They have a certain number of kill slots, but they still face the problem of the scalability because of the 500.
Did you want to comment on that?
Yeah, I agree a lot with what Bob has to say there. Is the economies of scale give an advantage to the ability to feed the masses. People still want a 99-cent hamburger at McDonald's. There's only so many dollars in a cow, and part of that money when it gets to the McDonald's hamburger has to go to other things, right? Who prepared it, who served it, etc. But the economies of scale in this processing facility situation are a bottleneck, and it hurts the cow-calf guy, which in turn is part of that rangeland market. Because as that bottleneck is created, everybody's in business to make money, right? So we don't blame them. It's just the efficiencies they can take advantage of create a harder situation to get more people in to this industry. And those dollars that are available, when you can do it for a lower input cost, creates more profit. So I had mentioned earlier our marketing chairman gave me some numbers, and he said he anticipates about $200 a cow to the cow-calf guy this next year. He anticipates $532 to the processor this year. Okay? If it's Bob's processor at $400 a head, you can take another $200 off of that for him. So now that margin's getting smaller and smaller. The thing is that the rangeland market, that cow-calf market, they're selling at a point, then somebody has to feed them to a point. The dollars can only be affected by them or created for them on either reducing input costs or increasing sales price. And I'm not talking about the sales price at the supermarket. It's when their part of the chain is complete. So their options are to hold them as Desert Mountain does, hold them all the way through that process. But now the total profit in that cow is reduced because his expenses are greater. So, as decision makers, as leaders, what we need to be able to look at is what other services are these people providing that we could compensate them for? How could we reduce their input costs? How do we increase their margin? Cattle price is just one small part of it. We talk about great cattle prices, but if we also then turn around and say, our fuel bill's higher, and we had to drive out and check them, and for this particular lease, it said we had to drive X number of miles to deliver water every day instead of creating a well or a cistern or whatever other water option there was for that cow due to regulatory burden, that decreases that margin. We lose our efficiencies from regulatory burden, from lack of scale, Those are the things that we need to put more dollars into our communities, our rural communities, our rangeland communities, and that benefits everybody in this state. Those open spaces here in our state of Idaho and across the West are not there because a large production facility for computer chips took up, water to cool their deal next to the river. They're there because of functioning rangeland industries. And I'm talking cattle ranches and sheep ranches across the West. That is the reason the open space is there, and that's why people are moving to this state. They enjoy that open space, and so do I. But we need to make sure they correlate their decisions. Like Bob said, they got to pay an extra dollar for his. They need to look at that and say, man, I'm going to pay an extra dollar because I want Bob's outfit to be there. I want the industries here in the state of Idaho to be here so that I can have open space to do these things that I enjoy on my public land.
That's great. I'm going to give you guys one more question and then ask Kevin for some questions from others. But so we've talked, and in the previous panel we talked about ecological challenges like cheatgrass, and then of course we've talked about drought as an ecological challenge, climate, other issues. But what about some of the social and economic challenges do you see in the ability of your industries to support local working lands and working communities? So think about some social and economic challenges that maybe you haven't mentioned or that are of concern. Do you mind starting, Cameron?
No, I don't mind. Some of the social challenges that we face in animal agriculture are currently related to, I would say, trends in nutrition. Ideas that a plant-based substitute can substitute for, natural meat. And I'm going to make a bold statement here, but I think it's pretty true, and I'll debate it with anybody. But animal agriculture is the basis of civilization. If we did not have animal agriculture, we would not have a city of Boise. We wouldn't have all of these things. And when you look at world hunger, the issue is not the amount of food necessarily, it's the distribution. And that goes to Bob's point. This livestock is mobile on its own, right? We can only get a carrot from one place to the other one way. So socially, we need to let people know that animal livestock production, meat production, all of those things, they are the basis of our civilization. And without it, we all have to go back to hunters and gatherers. And I know we're generations past that, and we've worked very hard to get there. But I hope I don't ever have to find out how many generations it takes to get back, because I think that side of it would go a lot quicker than the side that we had to go this route. So that's a societal issue with the negativity around animal agriculture right now, and we're seeing it a lot of places. But I'm always reminded a hungry man only has one problem, and it's not which sports athlete told him to use this protein powder or eat this or drink this. That's not a problem for a hungry man. If you offer them a corn dog on the side of the street and they're truly hungry, they're not going to ask if it's GMO. They're not going to ask if you have ketchup. They're not going to ask all those questions. They're going to consume the food. So I'm going to end on that.
I hope we don't get there. But either or two of you would like to comment on some of these issues.
Do you want to go first?
Oh, I'll think about it. Go ahead.
Okay, I can go. No worries. No, I completely agree with Cameron on the public perception of animal agriculture is a huge social challenge for us, especially when we look at this from a bigger picture. Food, as we consume it, is generational. I eat what my mother made me as a child. I make those recipes, and she makes them because that's what her mother made for her or father. Food is generational, and our food buying habits are also generational. And so if we get generations away from eating animal proteins or high density proteins like what we produce, we potentially lose that consumer base. In addition to that, one of the social challenges that we face, especially on the Western Range, and especially in Idaho, we've had a lot of people move into this state and they love the open spaces. I love the open spaces. I think we all can agree we love the open spaces, and we all want access to those public lands, whether it is trailing sheep through, grazing cattle, mountain biking, hiking. It's finding a symbiotic relationship and a balance between public land uses as well, and how we can work together on these public lands so it's beneficial for everyone. It's beneficial for the state, it's beneficial for the taxpayers, it's beneficial for you as a consumer, and it's beneficial for us as producers as well. Being able to coexist on these public open spaces is a social challenge, especially as we get into these small communities, and especially as we're bringing people into our state who don't have a history or a background with sheep production. For example, we keep guard dogs with a lot of our bands, and a lot of times people think those are stray dogs and they'll pick them up, and there's no bad intention here, but they'll take them to the public pound, and then my producer has to go and break them out of doggy jail. And so it's learning how we can coexist, and there's an educational piece in this as well. How do we educate the public about what we're doing and why we're doing it in a way that is constructive and educational and allows us to all coexist on this public range, especially as our states grow and more public recreation is being used. We heard a presentation earlier this morning at a different group that said, public parks, public lands are up higher than ever before in the last couple years. We've never seen so many users on our public lands, and I can personally attest to that. And as an industry, how do we work with them? How do we coexist and create a symbiotic balance that's beneficial for all?
And I will say that Meryl Beeler was here this morning from the Idaho Rangeland Resources Commission. We have a really unique situation in Idaho where producers pay money to the commission to help get that word out, and they do a wonderful job. Anyway, so I think that's one point at which we're progressive here in Idaho, and other states are taking our lead. I'm going to give you the last word, and then we're going to go to some questions. Bob.
Well, I get so far out there, sometimes I scare myself. They tell me the demise of every civilization has been the loss of its topsoils for the last 15,000 years. And it comes back to my son is a brainiac, and he says, whenever you get too far from your base in producing your food, you have to go away. And that's what I see. And it's fascinating to me, too, to sit here and talk about public land. In Idaho, all of the public land that's still public land was too poor to homestead. Right. We can BS whoever we want or how we want. They couldn't make a timber sale out of it or couldn't homestead it. And they tried in the 70s to come back and re-homestead the public lands of Idaho. But anyway, the social part of the whole deal is so fascinating, how far removed everybody is from what's going on, and how do we educate 325 million people? And I don't really know. I really don't have a really good idea. If you watch, the thing that is really fascinating to me is people buying that coffee for $6.50 a cup, and then worried about what they spend at the grocery store for, instead of buying $2 hamburger, buy a $1.75 pound hamburger. The math doesn't make any sense, any part of it. So I don't really know. What I know, what we targeted is we targeted a concerned consumer with our grass-fed beef business. So we were trying not to solve the bottom social issues. And it's been fine, but that's a totally different story.
Really good points. Outstanding. Kevin, is there any questions from the group here or online? Oh, it looks.
Oh, did you see someone?
Did you have one?
Oh.
Yes.
Hi, Caroline Nash with Blue Shift. I was really curious because there's been, with the USDA announcing the partnerships for climate smart commodities and some of the private markets coming in with B-carbon and some of the sort of credit agreements for producers. But what is, from a producer's standpoint, what are the right incentive structures in a credit to encourage participation and to not make it an additional burden or an additional oversight and additional regulation? Like, what would really drive producer adoption of those sorts of climate-facing credits that could provide another market for producers doing the sorts of work you're talking about of fire and carbon. Just curious y'all's thoughts on that.
Yeah, so anyone care to talk about how to promote these, I guess, climate benefiting aspects of livestock production?
So that's going to be a tough one to tackle in the livestock industry. We have varying rangelands, even when you look at moisture, productivity, amount of forage, et cetera. So then you got to look at what is the best way. Is it per cow? Is that the way to do it? Is it similar to an AUM? How do we give them credit? We have a pretty good understanding of how much a cow needs to consume based on her body weight. We know the average size of a cow. Do we want to use averages, or do we want to get down to a more local, intimate level where, are we talking about each ranch? And there's a comfortability level there that's going to be really individually based on producers. The beef industry is a unique beast. When you look at the other proteins we compete against, with the exception of lamb, most of those are pretty vertically integrated, right? They know exactly how many pounds of grain they got to put in to produce X amount of pounds of chicken. We expect the same calf that comes off the Owyhee Desert and the Florida Panhandle to look exactly the same when they hit our plate. But there's a lot of steps between our plate and when that animal happened. And so the hard part is saying how much credit do we give to each part of the chain in that carbon system, because the amount of grass per acre here is not the same as it is in Florida, and the whole system. It's just we don't have that captive system all the way across our industry. We're very unique, clear down to every individual ranch or even individual herd within a ranch. So I didn't do anything other than tell you a lot of information and not answer your question.
But Caroline, I think it's a good point. We had lunch together, and the fact that two relatively well-educated people who should know the answer to that question don't, then I think that's something we need to solve, that even us who promote the use of rangelands and livestock, we need to learn that and learn where the links are in the chain. So I would say a little bit of ignorance could be solved. Any other thoughts? Any other questions? Well, there's a question up front. Worries. Humorous.
Otherwise, I'll be a little too loud. Mike Gary, I'm probably the only sheep herder and cowboy in the room right now, but to cover both angles. But going back many, many years ago when I was working with Public Lands Council in D.C., we started a program called WLPA where we were going to try to influence the feelings of people in the East Coast cities as to public land issues in this country. And so we targeted one larger city. We spent $3 million over 3 years, and we were able to turn the articles from 2-to-1 against us to 2-to-1 in our favor. But as you can see, $3 million, many, many, many man hours, and we accomplished it in one city. We aren't accomplishing what we need to on a larger scale. I think today there's an opportunity, especially with you younger ones, and I can say that in Bob's instance too, because he's a year younger than me. But there's an opportunity we never had. It's not an opportunity that over the years I've warmed up to an awful lot, but the younger ones have, and that's social media. And we've got an opportunity with social media for a limited amount of cost to touch a lot of people. And that opportunity is there, but it also comes with a lot of challenges. And the challenge I have for you and the question I have for you is, how do we become that trusted source in social media so that people will accept and understand this that we know, but we're the less than 2%. How do we get it to the 98.5%?
Okay, anyone jump in?
That's a good first.
I would like first, if you ever start a TikTok channel, I'm on it, okay? And I say that in jest, but I think that's one of the challenges we have. I think we have a good story, people that are out on the range and people that are livestock, and we need to learn more.
So I would start with, I have a background in education before I took this role. And the one thing I always like to remember, and it was reminded me the other day, is in order to provide direction, you have to have movement, right? So when you talk about that type of campaign and the dollars that it took so much to create movement at that time that then in order to steer something was even a bigger lift. Movement happens quickly now through social media. Education in our younger folks is discovery-based now. They'll listen to you, but the first thing they're going to do, and I imagine if I was to throw out a stat in this meeting, everybody will look up if that's true or not. So I think what we need to do, Mike, is have a consistent message across our industry that shows the benefit. Because some of the folks that maybe aren't quite as in tune to animal agriculture or don't understand it and kind of see some fringes, they have a consistent message that I don't think I like this. They don't know why, they don't have a why, but if you can get the masses to say it, I hate that that's a fact, but if you can get the masses to say it, there's a group that is going to use Dr. Google to find the information they want to believe it. And because that movement happens so fast now, what we need to do is have a consistent message to take that movement and give it direction. And sometimes that direction we need is just to pump the brakes, slow it down a little bit. So I think you're onto something without having the total solution. That's my comment.
Well, I am going to bring this to conclusion. I think that's a great opportunity, social media. I also think that us becoming educated on some of these challenges, and then how do we help people understand how important rangelands and livestock are to local communities? I'm up for any ideas that you have. So thanks to all of you. My panel, Cameron, Bob, and Liz, you were wonderful, and thanks for this opportunity the Western Governors gave us to tell our story. Thanks.